Gue, Kinis kamijina, Taluidiji, Kamsquas, which Cabania Hayawisk, Uchija Hamij, Wade Desibo, Akinigalit, Wabeg, Mr. Beganagit, and to them mixture. Hanin, Migma Wisk, Unimag, Leomi. Greetings from my heart to yours. My name is First Dawn Woman. I come from traditional lands of Winnemagi, and my English name is Jane Meader. And I would like to offer a prayer to begin our session. Isok, Kiniskamijina, Kugamijina, Asa Highway, Munwalolek, Uchidulana Agwek, Dantiniganamuyek, Edamulek, Itkoivine, Edamulek, Iganamunen, Mungiganodi, Edamulek, Iganamunen, Exalsodi, Aganamunen, and Sedawahan, Abohan Muyek, Guess was Kunkachi, Gigamana, I guess Iganamahachi, a Tigix Kijinok. Siawit Wavinen, Guess was Skodamek, on the winter modahan. Nad Liach, am Signogama.
Hello. I would like to extend my gratitude to the land of the Wabanaki people and the earth itself for hosting this gathering of the Politics of Hope. I am a guest here, and so I express deep gratitude for permission from the people here to have me be a visitor, and I express deep appreciation for the land welcoming me here. Thank you very much.
Shalasi, bienvenue, welcome. Deluisi Deanne Sheppard, Talawi Dachumguk. My name is Deanne Sheppard, and I am from the land across the seas, now known as Newfoundland and Labrador. Walal and Juanita Muse for gathering us with the beautiful gathering song that was playing as you were waiting to arrive here tonight. Walal and Jane for your beautiful opening prayer and for starting this evening off in a good way. And thank you for your friendship on this journey as we prepared for these webinars. Truly, deeply appreciated. Walal and Leigh, for your beautiful land acknowledgement and for the teaching of how it should really be one of our Indigenous sisters as a guest to welcome us and to demonstrate a land acknowledgement. Thank you very much. Well, and Terry for inviting me to be your co-host tonight. It's been a labor of love, and she's a very hard woman to say no to. And it's the first time I've done something like this, so I'm really, really appreciating the opportunity, and just such a privilege to be with all of you tonight, and you're about to meet some of our esteemed guests. I also really appreciated the support from Catalina and Jeremy, so Walal, and I also wanted to really just also extend gratitude, Terry, for you sort of really appreciating what I might bring to this as a colleague at CBU and as an LNU woman as we enter into these conversations about politics and hope. I pass it to you, Terry.
Okay. Thank you, Deanne. It's my absolute honor to work with you. So I'm so happy that we have this little team going, and it's been wonderful. I just want to say a couple of quick words about myself and the series. So I'm a mother of two boys who are my greatest teachers, I have to say. And they have siblings and extended family in Panama. I'm also an educator and at times an activist. And I've been inspired over the years by liberation movements, particularly in Latin America and around the world. And I've been working with in solidarity with those movements for over 30 years. And that's rooted in a deep belief in the power of just regular folks to change the world, and that a belief that our everyday activity really matters and is important. And I am a settler of Welsh and English descent, and I've lived in Unama'ki since 2004, and I'm so grateful to be on this land. On behalf of the Global Social Justice Project and our co-sponsors, Unama'ki College, the School of Arts and Social Sciences at Cape Breton University, the Cape Breton Partnership, Planet Citizen, Peace Quest Cape Breton, and the Animal Ethics Project. It's my real pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to this gathering. I'm very excited. And we're especially grateful to our panelists today for agreeing to come and share their knowledge and wisdom, and we'll say a lot more about them shortly. I just want to say a couple of words about the series, The Politics of Hope, Building Resilient, Compassionate, and Inclusive Communities. Why this series? Why right now? None of these struggles are new, as all of us know, but I think many of us are feeling an increased sense of urgency to really confront some of the ongoing colonial relationships in particular that are having all these bursts of awfulness happening in our communities right now. And the obscene economic inequality that we're seeing in our communities and globally. And of course, the racism and sexism and homophobia that go along with that. And in the backdrop, we've got species extinction, climate change. So we really wanted to create a space to bring people together, to kind of acknowledge how we're feeling about that. So touching into our hearts, what this actually means to us at a personal level. And to really talk about the various ways that people are trying to confront these oppressive and violent systems, how they're breaking down the walls that separate us from each other, from other animals, and from Mother Nature herself. And our commentators and our speakers and our tech support, who are often forgotten, thanks Deanne for acknowledging them, they've been carefully chosen because they're people who are actively engaged in their communities, and they have chosen for their personal efforts to transform and heal our world and to model more compassionate ways of being. And so we really wanted to try to bring that into our process and our way of working together. And right now, at this point, I want to acknowledge Jeremy Martel of the Cape Breton Partnership, who's been doing our tech support, and Catalina Belalcazar, a scholar and activist in her own right, who is helping us with publicity and tech support in the backdrop from Colombia, of all places. So thanks to them for their hard work. I just want to say a quick word about housekeeping for all of you in our audience. A couple of things to bear in mind so that you can fully enjoy the event. Use the Zoom gallery view if you can, so that you can see all our panelists at once, and the chat box will appear on the side. If you'd like to ask a question, use the question and answer tool. And we welcome all respectful and constructive comments on the chat. We apologize in advance that our guests might not have time to address all of your questions, but we really want you to know that we value your thoughts and your ideas. And if there's things that aren't addressed today, we hope that you'll get to us and that we can pick them up in future sessions. So please enjoy.
Thank you, Willal and Terry. I just wanted to add to that, and I think you're absolutely right. I think these are charged times, and Terry and I, when we first started working together, actually didn't realize that we both had a significant interest in trauma, and so we want to be particularly trauma sensitive this evening. We were so excited to understand that why we had so much in common, because our teaching and our research sort of all melds into this social justice and activism piece. These past few weeks have been particularly charged in our Indigenous communities, and here in Unama'ki and in Mi'kma'ki, there's been significant acts of violence against the Mi'kmaq fishers. And so we want to be really aware of how we remember to take care of each other, and remembering that we're human first. And I think we were all, as we were chatting, getting ready to welcome you this evening, we were all talking about just how much time we've been spending on screens and Zoom and during this time of pandemic, and also in this time of unrest where we feel like we must actually commit even more to our communities and to be present. There's so much available that we want to be there for. But we're also going to remind you tonight to look after yourself and make sure that if anything that's spoken about tonight you find upsetting, to reach out to friends and family and make sure that you look after yourself. Maybe just give yourself a little pat if that sometimes is very soothing, but just to be aware of that. And also to feel free to reach out to Terry and I after this, because we're quite happy to debrief if something was said that was unsettling. But most importantly, what Terry and I both know is that telling our stories and listening deeply to other people's stories builds resilience and relationships in our community. So we're very excited to welcome you to listen to these fabulous speakers tonight and just sit back and enjoy and take good care. I wanted to just take a minute to introduce myself. I mentioned before that my name is Deanne Sheppard. I am the mother of 2 grown men and I have 2 grandchildren. I'm the oldest of 4 siblings, and I've been living and working here in Unama'ki just for the last 18 months. It's been a real coming home experience for me. I've been dislocated and disconnected from my land, language, and culture, and it's been a wonderful opportunity. I have spent the last 33 years working as a nurse practitioner in a variety of different settings, and I come to this work now sort of later in life, trying to merge the experience of of the way that I was raised and my family of origin with my professional work and now my academic work to sort of blend in, and really looking at the colonization of nursing and the work that nursing has to do to really address how we've been called out in the calls to action with the TRC, and just really working on decolonizing our practices. And so I think this work is becoming more and more important as we see things sort of unfolding right in front of us in these times of COVID. And Terry, I'll hand it over to you to introduce Jane.
Yes, it is my real honor to introduce Elder Jane Meader. I've gotten to know Jane in the last few months as we prepared for this series, and she has been a wonderful teacher and inspiration. As I said last time I introduced Jane, she's really one of those people who I feel really embodies compassion in the way that she works and just in the way that she is. And I find that so incredible and inspirational. Jane comes from the traditional lands of Unama'ki, and she's a mother of 6 and a grandmother of 7. She was raised and continues to live in Membertou. She's taught for St. Francis Xavier University and Cape Breton University, and has been teaching Masters of Education cohorts, specializing in Indigenous education and culturally responsive pedagogy. She's a Mi'kmaq language coordinator for the Membertou Band Council. She serves on the Mi'kmaq Language Advisory Committee for Mi'kmaq Kinamatawene, which I probably pronounced very poorly, and acts as an advisor to the Nova Scotia Department of Education in Mi'kmaq Studies and Treaty Education. She has told us that she's been blessed and privileged to have been exposed to many beautiful elders and respected knowledge keepers throughout her life that have shown her kindness and love through their wisdom, as well as a deeper understanding of traditional knowledge. As a Mi'kmaq woman, she embraces and acknowledges and continues to learn her ancestral ways so that she may practice and apply traditional philosophy and principles in her daily life. Although a university graduate, she considers the lessons she has received from the elders as the most significant and valuable education provided to her. So we're really privileged to have Jane with us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to now introduce Stephen. We're going to introduce our panelists so you get to know them a little bit, and they will say a couple of words about themselves if we happen to of missed anything. So I will begin to talk about Stephen here. Stephen I consider to be a dear friend. He's been an inspiration to me, both as an educator and as just being what it means to be a good citizen. And I wanted to just read a little quote from some writing of Stephen's that I find sort of fits very well with what we're doing this evening. This is from his master's thesis on a culturally relevant education for Aboriginal youth. And he says, "We have a duty as educators and as a society of the 21st century to develop curricula and accommodate ways of knowing and teaching that will fully recognize the relevance of Indigenous knowledge. In the same way that the concept of biodiversity has been accepted as vital to our planet's survival, we must also consider cultural diversity as vital to our survival as human beings. This diversity of knowledge sources might someday prove to be crucial. The traditional and cultural elements stored since time immemorial in our collective memory bank have to be released and redistributed through every means available today, including new technologies, videos, and the internet, which can reach remote places while at the same time an element of orality and be shared by the community in a circle concept." So I thought that was a beautiful quote. Stephen Stephen Augustine is a hereditary chief of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Affairs and Unama'ki College at Cape Breton University. He was in the past, from 1996 to 2013, curator of ethnology for Eastern Maritimes Ethnology Services Division of the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Gatineau, Ottawa. He holds a master's degree in Canadian Studies from Carleton University, focusing on traditional knowledge curriculum development in the context of an education system, and a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Political Science from St. Thomas University. He's always sharing his expertise and research and traditional knowledge with organizations, including government departments, the Assembly of First Nations, and various Aboriginal communities across Canada. He's part of an advisory panel on biodiversity issues, and he has worked extensively with United Nations programs of development and the environment. And he's constantly being asked to speak at conferences like this. So thank you, Stephen, for coming today. He's been accredited as expert witness in various court cases involving Aboriginal access to resources in the Maritimes, being recognized for his knowledge both of oral history and ethnohistory and of the treaties in the region. He's recently been named the recipient of the National Aboriginal Achievement Award for Culture, Heritage, and Spirituality. And he was, in 2009, got the New Brunswick Lieutenant Governor's Dialogue Award. And he has been also named the member of the Sectoral Commission for Culture, Communication, and Information for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. He's been an elder advisor to the Federal Court of Canada Judges, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the Human Rights Commission of Canada. And finally, in his role as hereditary chief on the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and by elders training since an early age, Stephen really demonstrates his knowledge and command of traditional practices, appreciation, acknowledgement of his language and the history of his people. So we're very honored to have him with us here today. Thank you, Stephen. And I'll go back to you, Deanne.
Okay, I'll move back to introduce one of our commentators first, Dr. Leigh Potvin, who is joining us. She's a colleague and an assistant professor at in Community Studies for Sport and Physical Activity Leadership and Department of Experiential and Community Studies. She's arrived into her academia as an experienced educator, and she's done her PhD in sociocultural and political context of education at Leigh University. Her focus is on gender equity, LGBTQ advocacy. Her research interests are on straight white privilege, respectful allyship, food security. She's also driven by her positive impact that she hopes to have on communities using feminist-oriented research. She's also very active in our community at CBU, with a variety of things connecting us to communities in ways that I have not imagined. She's creative, she's innovative, and she actually welcomed me here to the community as a new professor and made me feel very welcome. Did you want to introduce yourself, Leigh?
Sure, I can do that. Thanks very much, Tian. Yeah, my name is Leigh Potvin. I am originally from Thunder Bay, which is the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation, Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and I am an assistant professor at Cape Breton University in the Department of Experiential Studies in Community and Sport. I'm also a mom. I'm pretty new to the mom game. But I'm learning, and certainly that is my greatest teacher right now, like Terry. Also, I'm a partner. I forgot to mention my wonderful partner who does a lot of work behind the scenes to make it so that I can do these things in the evening and other times. And I'm a very, I think I like to identify as a person who asks critical questions of themselves and others. And I see that as a really important part of identifying my own privilege as a scholar and as a white woman and as an activist. So I think that's all I want to say about myself right now. Thanks very much for the opportunity, everyone.
Malal and Leigh. It is also now my distinct pleasure to introduce one of our speakers this evening, who you've also already heard from with the lovely land acknowledgement. And I can't actually express just what a privilege it is for me to introduce you, Leigh. And she's going to introduce herself more personally herself in a moment. But Leigh is a Stolo woman. She's a trailblazer, and she has opened many doors for Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. She is an award-winning author of over a dozen books. She bravely speaks her truth in her writing and inspires many of us with her activism and how she just lives her everyday life. She is a teacher at U of T, a guest lecturer at universities across the country. She is the recipient of numerous literary awards, an honorary Doctor of Letters from St. Thomas University, Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, and Officer of the Order of Canada. And I just sort of put the colonial titles at the end, Leigh. And I wanted to share something that I felt was an important piece of Leigh's writing that would introduce some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. And this is from Leigh's book, Memory Serves. And I picked it specifically, Leigh, because I find reading what you're saying so much more powerful than even your writing. So I won't do it justice because I don't have your spark, but here we go. Maps are about boundaries, social boundaries. They're marked by linguistic boundaries. These boundaries become symbols or metaphors, mapping responses. We are allowed to cross on the green light, but not the red. As we await permission to cross, we need only say red light, and everyone around us, including the blind, stops. We are aware that the words come in, or some variation of them allow outsiders to enter someone else's house. The assumption is that without permission, no one but the host is entitled to enter. When I identify as a professor at a conference organized by a university, I have much greater entitlement and authority than if I were to identify as an elder. Our word maps are uneven. Professors are European recognized knowledge holders, while elders are recognized knowledge keepers. Their systems of knowledge acquisition are different. Elders are considered less important in the academic world. Thus, if I speak as an elder in an academic audience, my entitlement of belief is narrowed and my place on the world map shrinks. However, if I move into the map of territory, my entitlement increases. As my entitlement changes, so do the boundaries shift. Conversely, as the boundaries shift, the nature and extent of my entitlement to belief shifts. Such shifts are based on cultural maps of entitlement and belief, and these cultural maps are articulated by story in oral societies. Over to you.
Okay. So you're beautiful. I'm sort of gobsmacked. I'm digesting all of that, and so I realized that, Jane, I didn't give you a chance to say a couple of words about yourself as commentator. If you have anything that you'd like to add to your introduction, please do.
Yeah, not really. I think you said it all.
She was happy.
But I think maybe Leigh wants to say something.
Good. I'm not sure when I'm supposed to, say something about myself, so I'll just be quiet till somebody asks me to talk.
Okay. Well, all our speakers are invited at the beginning of their session or their talk to say anything that they might just like to add about their experience. So we'd love to hear any of that. I want to now introduce Taeke Alfred, and I almost feel I don't know where to begin because I've followed his work for so many years and have found his work so inspirational, and not just his writing and scholarly activity, but how he demonstrates what it means to be a person in the world in a way that is engaging. And I have a quote from his book, Peace, Power, and Righteousness, that I wanted to share because I was trying to think, where do I want to start talking about Ty? And this quote kind of captured for me why I'm drawn to him and to his work. He says, in our relations with others, we need to engage society as a whole in an argument about justice that will bring about real changes in political practice. We need to convince others to join us in challenging the state's oppression of Indigenous peoples. This will require a broad-based intellectual and political movement away from prevailing beliefs and structures. All actions in this effort, not just our own, but those of everyone who support us, must be inspired and guided by 4 principles. 1, undermine the intellectual premises of colonialism. Number 1. Number 2, act on the moral imperative for change. Action. 3, do not cooperate with colonialism. Well, we can say that, but wow, what does that look like in practice? And thanks for that reminder, Ty. How do we do that? And 4, lastly, resist further injustice, which is an ongoing process in what we're doing in our daily lives. He says we can achieve decolonization through hard work and sacrifice based on these principles in concert with the restoration of an Indigenous political culture within our communities. So I feel like that quote really speaks to your spirit and to the spirit of what we're trying to do here. I just want to say a bit more about Ty, though. He is a Mohawk philosopher, a writer, a governance consultant, and a political strategist. His work focuses on the design and development of the institutions of Indigenous governance, Indigenous resurgence and self-determination, and the revitalization of Indigenous political systems, the impacts of environmental contamination on Indigenous communities, and the restoration of ancestral land-based cultural practices. Ty has served as an advisor on land and governance issues to his own and other Indigenous nations and organizations, and he's been an active supporter and participant in Indigenous governance and resistance movements since the late 80s. As a young man, he served as an infantryman in the US Marine Corps, and he earned his bachelor's degree in history from Concordia University and his PhD in government from Cornell University. He founded the University of Victoria's Indigenous Governance Program, and he's the author of many books and was awarded a Canada Research Chair. And he received Canada's highest Indigenous honor, a National Aboriginal Achievement Inspire Award, and was recognized with the Native American Journalists Association Award for Best Column Writing. He resigned his academic position after 25 years of teaching in universities to devote himself to working with Indigenous communities to empower their nationhood and activate their right to self-determination. He currently divides his time between Kanawake near Montreal, Quebec, and the Wasanic Nation territory near Victoria, British Columbia.
It's 7 o'clock.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, that's my computer.
And Ty played men's senior box and field lacrosse at the B and C levels in British Columbia for 15 years and 2 years as a player coach. He's an avid outdoorsman and the father of 3 sons who are members of the Laxilyu clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. So welcome, Ty, and thank you. Thank you so much for coming to join us this evening.
Thank you so much, Terry, for the introduction and the good words. Thanks to Deanne and Leigh for being part of it and for welcoming me. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion and share. You just reminded me, since the late 80s, so 34 years experience in First Nations politics and universities and getting involved in militant Native movements and trying to support the grassroots efforts of our people on nationhood. So it's a bit of a different scenario for me these days, given the work that I'm doing, to be able to talk about it in a kind of an academic, scholarly context. So I really appreciate it, and looking forward to it. The only thing I have to add outside of the introduction is I need to update my bio, because now I have a granddaughter too. So I've 3 sons and a granddaughter who is part of the Kwakwaka'wakw people. So that's the only thing I'll add for now.
Very exciting. So we'll now thank you, Ty. So we're going to now turn the floor over to Stephen, who is our first Elder Stephen Augustine, who is our first panelist. So Stephen.
Hello. Is my microphone on? Hello.
It certainly is.
Okay. Yes, I think all my life has been circling around the whole issue of orality and speaking and passing on knowledge that has been brought down through generations of transference, about ceremonies, about our relationship to the land, how we move around, how we survived, what our life was like before strangers arrived to this land. And basically, I find that how I came into the world kind of starts my narrative. It was my great-grandmother, who Isabel, that delivered me in 1949. And according to my parents and grandparents, my paternal grandmother, Agnes Thomas, was there in the room as well, witnessing my birth. And I came into the world as a potential leader of our people, since I came down a line of leaders called in our language Sa'ama. And so my great-grandmother touched my head to the ground when I was born, and introduced me to Akijinu Usitkamu, our mother, the earth, and saying, here we offer you our son, who is eventually going to rely on you for his survival. And then passed me over to my father, who took me down to a spring well and tossed me in there, turned me around, and apparently I screamed and hollered, and And he brought me back to my mother and placed me on her chest at her breast, and so that there started my life as a human being, Olnu, Uskijinu, and so a week later, my father took my uh, belly button, I guess, and he went and tied it with sinew on an old pine tree. And we call this pine tree guo. And an old pine tree we call gisiguo, meaning that it has grown very old. And our term for old people or elders in our language is gisigu. And it's in reference to a pine tree that is gone very old and knotty and gnarled, and uh, nobody uses anymore, but it is revered by our people as a source of our creation and a source of our leadership and a source of our knowledge and foundation. So Giziguo, some of our communities in our territory, especially Listuguj, makes reference to that Istugwowach, meaning the twisted, old, gnarled tree, and the place of our leaders. So Listuguj was one of the places that our foundation, the Mi'kmaq people, Uskijinu, it is considered to be one of the oldest Mi'kmaq communities in Mi'kmaqi. And I noticed that in Ojibwe territory in Ontario, Chingwak was a name of an old chief in Ontario. And Chingwak was a term referring to the pine, guo, gua, and Ching means the great pine, and descendants of those chiefs. Old Dan Pine, I remember running into him in Garden River many years ago when the Assembly of First Nations were conducting a prelude to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. They called us the First Nation Circle on the Constitution. And we traveled across the country and visited 82 Indigenous communities and heard from elected chiefs, elders, youth, women, Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve First Nations people or Indigenous peoples. And so we had made a report called To the Source. And so that learning experience for me for 5 years, five months, I mean, actually, it was during the Mulrooney government, and Joe Clark was the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. And so we put together a report called To the Source. And for me, it reinforced my early childhood education, growing up with my great-grandparents, my great-grandfather, Simon Joe Simon, and his wife, Isabel. Isabel was from the Augustine clan, which was really actually the Gwimu clan, the Loon clan among the Mi'kmaq people. And so she was my mother's grandmother. But on my father's side, Patrick Augustine, his father was Basil Tom Augustine, and his half-brother was called Noel Tom Augustine, which was my great-grandmother's father, who would have actually been my great-great-grandfather, was half-brother of my grandfather on one side. And their father was Tom Augustine, and Tom's father was Noel Augustine. Noel's father was Peter, and Peter's father was named Michael, And Michael Augustine was the guy that signed the treaty in Halifax on March 10, 1760. So these are education that has been passed down to me from the indigenous side of my family. And growing up, I lived with my grandfather, Johnny Simon, uh, like 4 or 5 summers in a row. We would start out our summer by boat going out to the mouth of the Rishabaktu River, and we would live up and down the coastline, up as far as Kujibukwak National Park and down as far as Buktush, but mainly along the mouth of the Rishabaktu River, where we would wait for fish, trout, salmon, eel, striped bass, and all of those that he would fish for those and take them to the fisheries market in town, and which was not too far away, like 5 miles away. We could row. Well, he was rowing the boat all the time, and we didn't have any motor boats, and so we lived on the land all the time, eating fish all summer, clams, oysters, lobster, and then later on in August, end of July, August, we started to eat strawberries and blueberries and all kinds of other roots that we traditionally relied on, and that's what I grew up with. Speaking my indigenous language, more or less the language of the land, describing almost every aspect of the land, the water, salinity of water, the transparency of water, wind conditions, and how do we counter those situations growing up on along the river systems. So we would be traveling, spearing eel at night. We would start probably around 9 o'clock and set up the place where we would follow the eel as they come into the river, up a river system, and then go across the river and follow them back out when because on the one side of the river we would end up scaring the eel, and they would go to the other side of the river. So we got to the end, we'd head back down, and we got as much as 300 pounds of eel every night, spearing probably beginning when the mayflowers bloomed. Sometimes it was at the end of April, and sometimes it was the beginning of May. And so these were more or less signals for us when it is the best time to spear the eel, when a certain flower was blooming and the eel were coming out of the mud. And then at the end of May into middle of June, the sea eels would start coming in at the harbor and at the mouth of the river, and we would be spearing those. They were all light green color and very big eels, very healthy, and lots of meat on them and oil. They were like the olican fish. We relied on the oil from the eel. I mean, we would eat it and dunk our bread and bannock and stuff like that and into it. It would be mixed in with other like pemmican and dried moose meat. We would have that with us. So we had a lot of ways of surviving. And when we arrived to the mouth of the river, I mean, we're basically building a shelter out of driftwood and seaweed. And my grandfather would build a fire outside, and he would bring a bowl, sometimes a metal frying pan, and he would bring the embers from the fire and bring them inside our shelter, because we had to smoke out all the bugs that were in the seaweed and all the insects that would be in our shelter. he would make a bed with, uh, he would put sand on there on one side, and we would have like stones around the fire that he would bring in during the night and put under in the sand underneath and cover them in with the sand, and then put a tarp, canvas tarp over, and we would just sleep on there. We didn't even need any blankets or anything. It was just so warm. It was almost like a sweat lodge inside. In the evening and in the morning, I remember I was like 7 years old, 8 years old. He would tell me to go and run, take my clothes off and run into the river. And that river was cold, 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 cold. And this was his way of telling me, this is how we survived, and this is how you survived your birth, because you were dunked in this cold water, and this is really healthy for your system. So, and my great grandmother explained to me that this was our people's way of determining if a child was going to survive or not survive, and if we had any kind of defects health-wise, they could be determined at that point. And there were lots of different practices that were engaged. And my grandmother actually told me a story about my grandfather, the birth of my father. Apparently, I didn't know this until a couple of years before my grandmother passed away in 1998. She lived to be 100 years old and 6 months. And she told me, she said, "Do you know, I had a daughter before your father was born?" And I said, "I didn't know that. Nobody told me that before. And even Dad didn't tell me." And she said, "Well, I'm telling you now." And apparently what happened was she had a hard time with her delivery. And the women that were gathered around to help her with her mother, Catherine, and other, like, it was her grandmother that brought her in, her first child into the world. And it was a girl, and it was a woman. A girl, female. And our practice, it's not practiced today. Infanticide, because of the fact that I was coming into a line of hereditary chiefs. The firstborn had to be a male in order to become qualified to be a chief, a hereditary chief in that line. And it reminds me of a series I'm following, Son of Trickster. Eden Robinson published a book, and she was writing about her traditions and her culture. And last night's scene kind of reminded me a bit of what my grandmother was telling me, that story about infanticide. But in this case, it was his father that he had to kill, I guess, drowned in the water in order for him to take on the role of a spiritual leader. And so that kind of reflected what the stories my elders passed down to me. And I have an older sister named Sandra, and she was born a year before I was. And I explained to her afterwards, I said, "You're lucky we were born in the modern times. As baby boomers, infanticide was not practiced at the time. And so I'm glad you're here as my older sister to help guide me and show me the way." And so that was kind of like an aside in terms of what I'm trying to say here. The importance of land. The creation story was told to me by my grandfather many times as a young kid, going to sleep, falling asleep with the stories of the Mi'kmaq creation. Dan Wedabek Sulti is like where we come from, the source of our creation. And my great grandmother told me that story. And us people, the Mi'kmaq people in Eastern Canada, we were, I don't know, our Grand Chief, Henry Membertou, was baptized in 1610 at Port Royal. When the Jesuits, actually not the Jesuits, it was a secular priest by the name of Jesse Flechet that arrived in 1610, and they arrived on Pentecost Sunday, 7 Sundays after Easter. And when they landed at Port Royal, they celebrated Mass because it was a big occasion in France, among the French Catholics, Feast of Pentecost, 7 Sundays after Easter. So observing that, our Grand Chief Membertou saw the chalice, the shiny things that the priest was wearing, and the garb kind of reminded him of how our spiritual leaders were dressing up with shells and porcupine quills, dyed porcupine quills, and bright colored skins and headdresses. So he really wanted to become one of those guys, like a priest. And so he asked, how do I join? And they said, well, you have to go through baptism. And they waited until the feast of St. John the Baptist on June 24th, and they baptized him and the rest of his family. And from then on, Membertou turned around, told all of our people, from here on in, we are all Catholics. And there was some kind of an understanding, I guess, from our people that the great chief has spoken, and we are all now Roman Catholics. At the time, I believe we didn't understand what the whole tenets and dogma around Catholicism was all about. I mean, it was a big show of being doused with water and a bit of salt in your mouth and oil on your forehead, and it was kind of symbolic to some of the ceremonies that we were doing with one another amongst ourselves. And so they didn't see that as invasive or destructive to our culture and traditions. It was only 100 years later, this engagement, I guess, became more in your face and against our traditional understanding of our own creation and things and so on and so forth. But it is considered to have been one of the first treaties entered into by the Mi'kmaq with the French and the church, I guess, the church and state at the time, which was France and Rome. And some of the church states was Italy and Spain, France, Portugal, and those countries that had Catholic churches. And I think Germans at some point in time were part of that Holy Roman Empire business. So early on, we accepted Catholicism, and our people kind of practiced this syncretism. They didn't really discourage us. They didn't, maybe the residential schools tried to discourage us speaking our language, but what happened was Grand Chief Membertou and a lot of the Mi'kmaq people that were traditionally following the Catholic Church ended up accepting the Catholic faith and moving forward and growing up. I was dragged into the church and baptized. I was first communion, second communion, or whatever, confirmation. I was married in the church, and my children, because my parents wanted their grandchildren to be baptized in the church and so on. And I am a member of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, and I having respect for my elders, I did not want to stand forward and make statements against the church. The only thing I said was, well, a belief system. Every human being has a right to their own belief system, and I respect the decisions that the elders made to respect the Catholic Church. I mean, and I think our people were not really educated well enough into the mainstream and the realities of human rights did not even enter into our realm of thinking. They were to some degree by certain individuals. If we look back historically, some of our leaders stood out and complained, but the majority of our people ended up following what colonialism did to us, so our Grand Chief at the time, member two, was practicing our traditional ceremonies, and our Mi'kmaq Grand Council were also practicing our traditional ceremonies, even at the time when these. I just checked out and saw my message. Sorry, I have to leave it there. But in closing, I would just say that I wanted to focus on the Mi'kmaq creation story being our foundation in terms of our relationships with bird, plants, animals, and fish, and the land, that we took the land and enveloped ourselves, our culture and language and traditions comes from the land because our ceremonies are negotiating for our survival. And this is how we showed our appreciation to our Mother Earth, and by doing ceremony, pipes, sweat lodges, and so on and so forth. Thank you. Walalio.
Do I just start? My name is Leigh Maracle, and I want to add a few things to the introduction that was given me. I have an honorary doctorate from Sir Wilfrid Laurier University as well, and I am a Siam for my nation, and that is a power position. It means that I know something about who we are, that I have a history and a track record of walking our children home. That's what we call it. We don't educate children to the culture. We walk them home. And home is in our ceremonies. It's in our stories. It's in our history. It's in our songs. Everything, in fact, begins with song and story. And of course, dance. And our children learn these things. And we, as Siams, expand the viewpoint of each story. So a story, the creation story, is a good one to begin with, because we came here via the spirit world, and elder carried us here, and we have to get our feet on the ground. And sometimes the little children don't get their feet on the ground because maybe a parent dies, and later on in life they will have trouble with the little child inside them who, you know, was somehow cheated of a part of his or her history. And so then you tell that story again and ask them to think about what they need to do to make sure that child is assured that they have a life inside you, that they still have a life, even though they're a child. But they cannot drive the bus. They cannot guide you. You must guide them, and they must give you permission to do that. And so that helps the person to be less confused. That's what we call walking someone home. Some people these days call it healing. We don't. Although there's no real English word that describes how it is to transform the self from someone who's off the path and not going home, going away from home, and someone who has returned to the path to go home. So then we have to think about, well, what's home? Well, my territory is about the size of France. It starts at Siletz, Oregon, which is the bottom of Washington or the top of Oregon, over to Flathead, Montana, which is a big chunk of Montana that goes into Washington. And then it becomes part of Canada in my territory, all up to Squamish and over to Vancouver Island. All those territories are part of the Salish world. And we have 11 nations within that world. The Stalo Nation is one of them. That's the one I'm a member of. My village is Tlitwakut, which is the name of the waters that I come from. Where I am from, it is the water that's important. In fact, asparagus, all the asparagus that you see out there, purple asparagus, white asparagus, green asparagus, is originally an ocean plant. We brought it to the land to share with our interior Salish relatives, but it grew in the ocean waters, in the lagoons of the oceans, and for thousands and thousands of years, and then it became a land plant. In the ocean, that asparagus has all the minerals that we'll ever need in our life. So when they destroyed our shorelands, they also destroyed the asparagus that grew along the shores, and the little cabbages, they kind of look like not broccoli, Brussels sprouts, you know, the things that grow on branches. Europeans grow on branches, but they taste very, very different. And they're very rich in minerals and vitamins and things like that that we need. We didn't actually pick very much food from the land. Everything came out of the water, the salmon, the whales, the seals, the kelp, everything came out of the waters. And so it is only when I came here to the east that I came to appreciate the land. But that was one of the things my elders said, is that I should go east to come to understand other people's relationship to the land. Our land is behind us and it's mountains. We love those mountains, and we have our ceremonies on those mountains, and we walk across them. I've walked across them about 14 times in my life and climbed them, cliffs and all, and taken my children up there, because our ceremonies are tied to coming to be at one with the mountains. That's very, very important to us. But the land itself doesn't produce much in the way of, you know, gardens and food, and because it's mountains. Anyway, that's part of the difference, I guess, between the Salish sea-going people and everyone else. We are also we were in the, you know, a long time ago, more connected to Hawaii, which is the middle of the Pacific, and Ainus in Japan, and Melanesians, Micronesians, Maoris, and so on, than we were to anyone on the other side of the mountains. We didn't have much to do with anyone who wasn't coastal or ocean going before Europeans came. When Europeans came, they came over the mountains, which kind of surprised us, took us by surprise, but they only arrived there in 1835. And there were a lot of people in the 50s, when I was young, that were alive when they first came. And they didn't go to school, and they didn't speak much English, you know, mostly Ho'okamalam or Squamish, or, you know, other languages like that. And so if you wanted to know something from them, you had to speak the language. And that became an important thing for, you know, people like myself who wanted to learn something. And I was told the stories in the language, and I was told the teachings that went with them in the language. And so it forms part of my memory bank. Not very many of our kids speak that language today. And I don't actually have a problem with that, although everybody says, well, you have to know the language in order to know the culture. I actually disagree with that, because culture is the way we do things. Language is the way we speak. And language expresses our heart. So if we have a good heart and we're fully invested in home, then we will speak well, whether we speak English, French, or Hulkameelam or Squamish. And also, there are a lot of languages where I come from. There's 11 in our nation, in our confederacy, and some of our old people used to speak 2 or 3, but nobody spoke them all. So when English came, it was someone, I think, said it, I said it, it's kind of a relief, because now we won't quarrel over whose language should we speak this meeting in, because we don't want to be jealous of each other's language. So that was seen as something of a relief, although the language is being picked up by younger children who want to know it. And I think that's a good thing. I just don't think that they will necessarily be more stallo than those who are my age and don't speak the language. And the reason for that is what my father said, is they're teaching them Hulkameelam as though it were English. They're translating from the English to Hulkameelam. So they're just learning another kind of English, and we should be very careful about that. They have to get the love and the meaning and the understanding of who they are from us. They can't get that from teachers who are teaching them Hulkameelam in translation. So that becomes a problem today of, how do we deal with this? But the other part of all of it is that Europeans generally, where I come from, I don't know about here, but they look upon Canada as their country, and it's not. It's not. That's all there is to it. If I were to move to Germany today and try to take out citizenship, I would have to learn German customs, German culture, German ways, German law. And I would have to abide by it all. You came here to Anishinaabe territory or Haudenosaunee territory or Salish territory and didn't bother learning the laws that were there. In fact, you violated our laws and you violated us. So that means that the land itself is colonized, and so are we, and so are our various laws and cultures. And until I see people picking up on who they are in the context of where they are, that is, they're not in Europe, they're not in Asia, and they're not in Africa. They have to be firmly located here, and they have to want to make this their home. In order to make this their home, they have to agree to decolonizing the whole territory, all of it, and stop saying, Canada's 150 years old. First of all, Canada means village. Villages are millions of years old. That's the first thing. So truth has to be told here. And we need to encourage people to develop a relationship to the land and to the waters that are here. You have to learn to hear the land speak to you here. You have to learn to be able to listen to the waters that are talking to you here. And you have to behave in accordance with the laws that exist here. That is, take care of the land, take care of the water. Do not violate the natural world. When that happens, then we'll be on our way to being able to build sustainable relationships. I cannot have a sustainable relationship with someone who is violating the land, violating the natural world, violating the plant world. I also think someone was talking about being connected to food security, and that's a big buzzword where I come from too. But the food that we're secure about is not understood. We should be securing the food that was here before. We should be rebirthing the buffalo, rebirthing elk, rebirthing camas, rebirthing sea asparagus, tearing up the docks that they built. that's the food that we need to rebirth, because that's the food that sustained us. That's the food that made us healthy. That's the food that made us human. We were human beings when we ate right. I think Stephen mentioned Ulican. Ulican's a Greece where I come from, and it kept us from having arthritis, bursitis, all kinds of illnesses, flus, coughs, colds, everything. But the Ulican in the Fraser, the Stalo River, really, but you call it the Fraser. The Fraser is now toxic, so that the fish that we're processing is also toxic. So we had to clean up the river in order to restore the Ulican to its birthright. It has a birthright to live clean and to be free of toxins. We all have that birthright, but the Ulicans do too. And I think that's something that non-Indigenous people don't understand. If their animal world and plant world is toxic, we consume that, we eat that, then we're toxic. We're not disconnected from these worlds, we're connected. And so once we understand that and start taking care of the land and the animals and the plants, then we will also be taking care of ourselves. It's all one connected group. There's no separate, the human beings are over there, the animals are over there, the trees are there, and so on. No, we're all connected together, and we need to understand that profoundly, or we're lost. I just can't express that strongly enough. So that's how I feel about the land. And I also want to say a little bit about the word decolonizing. A colony, if you think of viruses, not tuberculosis in the lungs, they colonize the lungs. They consume the lungs and eventually they fill the lung up and they kill you. That's what colonization is. When a parasite comes in and takes over the territory and consumes everything edible until the territory begins to die. That's colonization. So when we decolonize, what are we doing? We're actually rebirthing. We're rebirthing the language, rebirthing knowledge, rebirthing culture, rebirthing song, rebirthing whatever it is that we're trying to decolonize. So I think we should not focus on the buzzword decolonize, but focus on what it is that we're doing. Because I think here we're trying to get people to relate to the land in the way that people have always related to the land, or at least in our living memory, so that the land will be teeming with life, healthy and clean, and we can consume the foods from it. It will be good for us and good to us and good to the other beings that belong on this land. And we need to restore some of the beings that were denied a place here. I think the buffalo is the biggest example, but where I'm from, it's elk. We're starting to restore elk to the territory where I'm from. That's the only four-legged that we ever ate. We didn't eat deer. We don't even like it. Moose, I'll eat it if there's nothing else. But elk, that's our specialty. That's what we ate. That's what we thrived on. And our mountains were full of elk. And they killed them all. They killed them all so they could kill us. The destruction of the food sources of this continent had the object of destroying us. Make no mistake about that. They had the objective of destroying the people living here. And now that that's seen as a bad thing, everybody wants to decolonize. Well, it's restoring the life that was here because the colonialism killed us. Thank you very much. I'm done. I will pass the floor to Ty. By the way, I had 15 minutes as opposed to somebody else's half hour, just to let you know.
I'm going to start off by following up on a number of points that were made by Leigh and then Stephen before her. Before I kind of shift into what I was going to focus on and what I am going to focus on after that, which is more the politics today around land and our movement as nations to get to the places that our ancestors were in relation to the land. But just keep the conversation flowing. I want to pick up on a couple of things that were said. I found very interesting. I had known before Stephen's discussion about pine tree and the words, the etymology of the word in his language, and relating it even to the Anishinaabe and Chingwak. It's interesting to me that the symbolism of that pine tree is the same in our nations, the way that it was described in Haudenosaunee cultures too. The pine tree chief is a very significant part of our governance system. It's a person who represents the ability to persuade, to speak, that has a special gift, as you might say, to communicate, or a special insight, or some quality that the clan mothers and the chiefs want to be part of that overall decision-making structure in the council. And also the chiefs and clan mothers are represented in one aspect of the great law telling as great pine trees protecting the people from all of the winds and all of the bad things that could come into the circle. So the imagery was interesting to hear because of its resonance. And it got me thinking that, and reminded me actually, that there's so many different ways in Indigenous cultures and languages of expressing ideas that are the same. So the reason we can talk about Indigenous this and Indigenous that and indigeneity is because there is this commonality and this idea of the way that you should, as a human being, be in the world and relate to the land and relate to the other elements of the natural world. And I think we're seeing that here today. Even when Stephen talked about ceremonies, I think the way he put it was ceremonies are negotiations of survival. I like that. It's a very poetic way of saying it. And it's negotiation of survival with the natural world and all of the forces that exist in that world that allow us as human beings to exist as individuals and communities, and to honor the gifts that we've been given by the Creator. And Leigh, in her way, in my mind, listening, picked up on some of those themes too. And when she talked about a CM and the role of a CM, a leader or a chief in guiding the youth, one of the things that resonated with me that you said, Leigh, was when you phrased it, expanding the viewpoint of stories. Really interesting and engaging way of talking about the purpose of stories. And I think the relationship of people, if I may say, in listening to you in the way that I took it, the relationship of us to a story, us being individuals in terms of how it comes through our mind and sits within us, and then the way we manifest it, but also as communities, as families, as longhouses, as communities, how do we relate to these stories? And that idea of expanding the viewpoint immediately resonated with me as a Mohawk, in the idea of, in our culture, they talk about it extending the rafters. So there's all these stories, there's the great law, there's all these teachings that are central to who we are, but there's also the principle of extending the rafters. So the idea comes from, in a longhouse, it's built to accommodate a certain number of families, and presumably it was done because it's that size and it's the way it is because that's what's needed at that time. So there's a certain number of families, the house has to be a certain size. The understanding is that, over time and the way human societies go, there's going to be a need to expand it over time. And so the law and the stories are not set. They're told for a certain time, for a certain place, and they serve the people as long as they serve the people well. And the people's responsibility is to engage with those stories and to, when necessary, extend the rafters, meaning engage with those stories. Or as Leigh would say, expand the viewpoint of the story. And so, again, you see a resonance from way out on the West Coast to the Haudenosaunee among people who live in a certain way close to the land and in a respectful relationship with each other, embodying the teachings that come from living in that intimate way with the forces that animate the natural world. And so when I think about Indigenous teachings, it immediately strikes me is that we have different languages and different terminologies and different ways of expressing these things, but the ideas are very, very similar. I'm firmly convinced of that. And the more I travel all over the world, and have traveled all over the world to do this kind of work, the more it sinks into me is that we need to get back to that relationship to the land, as Leigh was describing eloquently. You know, industrial society, and before that, colonial, the first phases of colonialism, and now technological society has really created a reality for all human beings and drawn our people into it forcefully, where we're separated, where we've been separated from the true source of our own humanity. And all of our cultures all over the world are paying for that. And so the true objective of decolonization, and if we think about what's the goal in relation to the land, is to restore that connection. And Leigh's talking about the difference. I'm really glad you did bring this forward, Leigh. The difference between culture and language is very important, and I think crucial for this next generation of activism going forward on our nationhood and our lands, because it's become a bit confused in my mind. You know, having been in it for quite a while now, like I mentioned, over 3 decades of being involved in this, and coming at it as a young person and seeing in the 1980s the kind of teachings that were brought forward and the kind of principles and motivations that we were taught, with its problems, of course, but centrally it was focused on that. It was about maintaining or restoring that crucial connection to the land that allows us to maintain ourselves in the vision of our ancestors. And it was about what you do. Language is important, songs are important, ceremonies are important, the way you communicate is important. But crucially, it was about what are we doing? If you think about the activism in the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s and the early 90s, it was about people occupying land. It was about people doing things to go and defend territories and so forth. And there's a smattering of that going on now. Importantly, it should be mentioned, you know, Mi'kmaq people acting on their right to fish, Wet'suwet'en people defending their sacred territory from pipelines and attempts to destroy it, people in 6 Nations defending their land, the treaties that they had, their sacred responsibilities there. There's people doing that, but on the whole, our politics have shifted. Politics have shifted really towards the other aspect of the whole equation, you know, in terms of being a human in relation to the land, and being an Indigenous person in relation to the land, the culture, in terms of what you do to defend that land and to act on your responsibilities to the land, has kind of taken backseat to what you say. And I think a lot of that reflects technological society that we live in, and importantly, the agenda of the Canadian and American governments reflected in this whole idea of reconciliation, which is saying something is more important than doing something. So if you say you're decolonizing, if you say that you really respect Indigenous peoples, if you put out a land acknowledgement, if you do this, that's enough. Or it's decolonizing to say the right words. When in fact, if you take a microscope to the situation and you look at it, and you look at what people say versus what they do in relation to land, there's a big disjuncture. And I think that it's very difficult these days to see through that in a lot of cases. It's very difficult to kind of negotiate your way through that as an Indigenous person who cares about the land and wants to take action to reflect that ancestral vision. And I think that that to me is the crucial shift in the politics that we've seen over the years, where it's shifted from land and nationhood to really about identity and inclusion in the Canadian politic. And it's something I think that is an active agenda on the part of the Canadian government, where if you think about the kind of things that were going on in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, as I mentioned earlier, you really had this revival coming out of this era of active suppression of our culture and our language and our ways of being. Everything that we're talking about here was suppressed and criminalized. And then you had this rebirth in the 1960s and 70s of the pride, of the willingness to identify, of the ability to organize. And it had its reflections in all of the different areas, in law and politics and culture and so forth. And you had this kind of movement that developed into the 1970s and 80s of a real commitment on the part of Indigenous people to bring those all together. So people understood the dynamic that we're talking about, they understood that you cannot have an effective land defense without a cultural foundation. They understood that you need to really focus on creating the base for bringing people in an organized, unified way to defend their land through ceremony, through culture, through storytelling, through all of these different things. And that's what they did. And so Red Power movement and all of the kind of things that happened in our communities from British Columbia in the 1980s, where people under the direction of matriarchs in the Gitxsan Nation and the Wet'suwet'en Nation and all over the Northwest were blockading roads, were reviving ceremonies and using spiritual power and ceremonial power and just the power of the people in a unified way, focused to defend what is the right of their ancestors and themselves and their children to use the land in a way that they determine is right for themselves. Doing all that kind of stuff. People at Anishinaabe Park in Ontario, and of course, the one that's best known, but I think is just part of that longer tradition of a lot of different Indigenous peoples. You got Listuguj with the fishing, but the one that's best known, you know, in 1990, the struggle of our people to defend territory, but it was a much larger struggle too. It was an effort, and I think a real true manifestation at the time to bring all these things together to really activate nationhood, to live out Indigenous nationhood in its true sense. And no doubt in 1990, it was at a stage where there was a lot of things left uninvestigated, a lot of hypocrisies, a lot of things that were problematic and so forth. But it was moving towards the idea that Indigenous people are organizing, are building a cultural and spiritual base in order to take back what is ours, take back the land. There's a phrase on social media now, #landback. Well, that's what we were doing in the 70s. That's what we were doing in the 80s. And I oftentimes ask myself, well, what happened in the meantime? I'm in my mind, in my analysis, having lived through it and worked through it in various contexts, what's happened is that people who think for the government, people who think for the corporate interests that benefit from our colonization and our separation, our disjunction from the land, thought through this just as hard as we were thinking through it and poured all kinds of resources into universities, into the arts, into all kinds of forums, organizations and communities and so forth, to try to divert the energy that was arising in Indigenous communities that was radical, in the sense that it brought all these things together in a very simple way that said, this is, as Leigh said, our country. We have treaties, we have legal rights, we have ancestral rights to live by our laws on our territory, and we're going to organize our people on a cultural, spiritual, and physical level in order to activate that, because that's our responsibility, not only to our future generations, but if you think about it too, our responsibility to the salmon, to the pine trees, to the fish, to the bugs, to the waters, because for 10,000 years, we were weak, we were suffering, we were unable to survive without their help. And colonial society has poisoned all of those things, has disrupted those sacred networks, has made it impossible for them to continue to live in a healthy way, as Leigh mentioned. And so we don't only have a responsibility to ourselves for our own rights, for our own self-respect. We don't only have a responsibility to our next generations, to our kids and grandkids, to make sure that they can grow up as well. We also have a set of responsibilities to all the plants and all the fish and all the animals and the water and the land as well. And so we were moving towards activating that, and the government recognized it, and it poured millions and billions of dollars into a program to dissuade us from that. And what was the agenda that was brought in through reconciliation, through ideas embedded in the concept of Aboriginal law and Aboriginal rights and title and so forth? It's the fact that Indigenous people need to compromise with colonial society, and the essence of colonial society gets to remain the same, and we have to find a way to live within that framework and that structure. So we need to reconcile. So what we're being asked to reconcile is our failure to live out our responsibilities to our grandchildren. We're being asked to reconcile our failure to live out our responsibilities of reciprocal obligation for 10,000 years of survival and gifts to the salmon, failing to do that. And we're asked to reconcile instead, to turn and look and say, all you colonial people who live by these mythologies and these lies and all these things that you've created to make yourself feel good about stealing our land, we're going to honor and respect that and turn our back on our grandchildren and the salmon and the land. But it's going to be a very attractive proposition because it means that we don't have to go through what our recent ancestors went through in standing up on front lines and suffering racism and suffering bullets and suffering beatings and so forth. And for a long time, for a few years, I would say, I'll keep it optimistic here. For a few years, that was a very attractive proposition, you know, from 2000 till about a couple of years ago. I think it was a very attractive proposition, especially for people who weren't really benefiting from the heritage of storytelling and the passion that was imbued in us growing up in these communities. It was very attractive to say the idea of Indigenous decolonization and our relationship to the land is to figure out a way to fit in with the system of economic benefits that the Canadian colonial society has created on that land and disregard our own ways of looking at the land and our own relationships there. But as we're seeing, and the ones that I mentioned are not comprehensive for anybody that's coming new to this issue here. I mentioned there's the 1492 land back issue going on at Six Nations in Ontario. There's the Mi'kmaq people asserting their rights to lobster fish. There's the ongoing struggle of the Wet'suwet'en people, the traditional Wet'suwet'en people, to protect their sacred lands from development in favor of pipelines and so forth. And these are just three that I'm mentioning. These things are beginning to take root in the culture of Indigenous people through young people's activism. And I think that we're going to start to see much more of a shift of a much more activist in the traditional sense that I'm talking about it, sense, because a lot of the impacts of learning the language and being given traditional teachings, of being rerouted in ceremony, and just being mentored about ancestral teachings by elders who are still connected to culture on the land is starting to have its effect among the leadership of the next generation of leaders in our communities. And people are starting to reject the idea of reconciliation as an all get along mentality and really starting to look at it from the perspective of the ancestors as much as we can. We'll never be able to emulate the indigeneity of our ancestors, but we can get the essence of it. And I think that the essence of it through story, whether they're told in English or Hokumenum or Ganyageha or whatever language that we speak, the essence of it is getting conveyed to younger generations. And they're starting to really act on that. And I think that, you know, I've kind of traced the pathway of Indigenous resistance, if you want to label it that, from this kind of surge of energy and surge in spirit and an effort to restore our proper place in our homelands, to an attack on that in various forms in a multifaceted way to try to divert that. And now we're seeing a resurgence. And we're seeing a resurgence of this idea that is much more reflective of an ancestral vision of what it is to be Ungwahumwe or Indigenous than anything that's out there in Aboriginal law circles or in reconciliatory dialogue or anything like that. And I think that this is reason for hope in spite of the colonial story that we've all been living with over the past few years. Daneto. I'll turn it over to our commentators now.
We would like to extend our invitation to Leigh to bring us into further thought and conversation. And then after Leigh Maracle, we will hear from our commentators and the rest of the panelists.
it's not that I wanted extra time. I appreciate it though, but I think the timing has to do with sharing. That we need to share evenly the time that we have, and that didn't happen. And it's not the first time it has not happened. And it does seem to be a pattern that we've kind of sunk into, that we just start going and then we keep going until we get tired of talking. I'm very cognizant that we should share our time. I share everything. I share my food, my time, my thinking, and I appreciate all the remarks by the two gentlemen, and particularly Taigi for recognizing some of the important things that have gone on, that we're using language that keeps us included in our own colonization. And I think that we have to move away from that. We have to back away from that. And so we have to understand that it doesn't matter where you're speaking English or Halkamilan. If you're talking about being included in colonial society, you're talking about oppressing yourself. So that's the last thing I want to say. Thank you very much, everybody. And thanks for your kind-heartedness. Everyone, you're very kind to me. Time for the commentators.
Thanks, Leigh. I'm here. Jane, I think that I want to offer to you to go first if you had any thoughts.
I actually, first of all, I'm very, very grateful to the speakers. And I too am not, I guess, say, a big fan of reconciliation. It's not that I'm not a fan of reconciliation. It's not done in the way I think our people would have done it. To me, first of all, reconciliation is renewing a relationship. We never had that relationship to begin with. And that's an honest relationship where we treat each other with respect, with dignity. And you know what? Some of the things that we talk about, like in our own, as Mi'kmaq people, when those wampum belts were read, some of the wampum belts that we had treaties with other Indigenous nations, in those wampum belts, all your protocols were in there that taught you what you were to be like, how you were to behave. If you went into Haudenosaunee territory, there were certain rules you followed when you went into their territory. If you went into the Wampanoag territory, there were certain rules you followed. And you did everything not to disrespect the people whose lands you're on. And I think that is a relationship. What we've had with Canada is not. What we've had with Europeans is not really. And when we talk about reconciliation, from what I was taught from my elders, reconciliation, if you did something wrong, you apologize, you say, I'm sorry. And then there's two things in the center. One is restitution. The other is forgiveness. But Canada has forgotten about restitution. They said they were sorry about the residential schools. They expect us to forgive, and they call that reconciliation. Reconciliation is when we can walk hand in hand with a deep understanding, with love, with respect for each other, with love and respect for that land. When, like our ancestors, when we understand that we are part of that land and that land is part of us, it's not separate. It is who we are. And I like the way one of our chiefs once wrote in a letter in the 1800s. And he says, Wajiskaliadi Mi'kma'ki. What he's saying is we have sprouted out of this land. We are from this earth. This is where we come from. Not across the Bering Strait. None of those other theories, but we are from here. We are as indigenous to this land as the grass in our lands, as the trees in our lands. We're part of them, and they are part of us. And we have an understanding, we have a relationship with them. It's not just, it's respect, it's a relationship, and it's reciprocity, that we treat each other well, and say the land treats us well, and so and so should we. Be mindful, be respectful of this land we walk on. And I've often heard elders say, the best thing that we can do for the land is to walk on the land with love. If we walk on the land with love, we respect each other, we respect the land, we respect the animals, and we treat all of creation with dignity. And I think I've said enough. I'm going to pass it over to you, Leigh. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I feel like, it's a really difficult job to be the person who speaks last in this group. So I suppose for me, what I was thinking about, and Leigh, I am the one that is the food scholar. And so I was really compelled before you commented specifically on food, about the way that food was playing a role in everything that was being discussed, and the relationship between the lands and waters and the food that we eat. So I don't want to make it all about me and this thing that I'm interested in, but I just wanted to say thank you for what you offered in terms of, I wrote it down. We have to be secure, or we have to secure the food that was here before, and that is the food that made us human. And I'm really grateful for that. That's very compelling for me, and I'm sort of rolling that around in my brain. And to tack that on to what Tayagi said about the role that corporations or corporate interests or capitalism alongside colonization may have played in all of these elements of this world that we live in. And then again, thinking about my own work and the way in which corporations continue to play this role in providing us with foods that are, or making us think that we're dependent on these foods that are toxic for all of us. Anyway, I want to stop because I've seen a couple questions come in, and I'm still processing, so I don't want to ramble too much. So there is one question. Do we have Catalina and or Terry and Deanne? Do we have time for that? Some questions? I think, yes. No one's telling me no. So one of the questions submitted by Sandra Thompson was a thank you to all of you, and then a question to all of you, which is, if non-Indigenous people were able to recognize that we are connected and have responsibility to this land, is this enough for us, meaning settler people, to understand that we need to stop being colonizers? You're muted, Leigh.
One of the things that I learned from Susan Blight is some white guy said, we should be more inclusive to you. And she says, oh, that's not anywhere near the point. You need to try and be included in us. If you take up caring for the land, we might want to have a relationship with you, and then we can include you in our way of being. It might encourage us to be more forthright with you and more engaging of you. But right now, as it is with the destruction to the land, we're absolutely convinced you are not fit for our society. C'est vrai.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Sure. I'll follow again and build on what Leigh said. And I agree. And the question after that one would be, well, where do we take our direction from? If someone wants to seriously commit to transcending or escaping this kind of vicious circle of colonization and so forth, well, to me, I think our ancestral vision that we had that's embodied in the Goswanta Turo Wampum is reflective of most Indigenous nations' views on this. It's our cultural expression of it, but it's reflective of most Indigenous peoples in the way they look at a proper relationship. And I think that it's recognition that the framework of ethics and values and the principles and the teachings that go into guiding human beings in their relationship to the land that came out of Europe are bankrupt. Climate science, all indications are that European ideas are destroying the world, and we don't have that much longer to go if we continue to follow the wisdom, in quotes, of European thinkers. And so where do we go from there? The answer is obvious to me, and I think to any Indigenous person and to many young non-Indigenous people, which is that you look at the people who have sustained themselves in this land for tens of thousands of years for those answers. What's the basic teachings that you should use? What are the basic teachings that you should use to reorient your society? Not to roll back 10,000 years, but to say, what are the basic principles that we should be embedding in our institutions of governance, and how should we reorient our economy, and what kind of choices should we be making as societies and all the way down to consumers? Yeah. And I think and we don't have another 2 hours to talk about this, but that's the short answer to mine, which is if you really respect this idea of the two-role relationship, one side has proven to have very wrong answers. One side has proven to have very good answers. So logic tells you, let's follow the answers of this this side for a few thousand years and see what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you. Stephen, you want to go?
He's going to say something.
I'd just like to say that entering into conversations about governance and education, philosophies and decolonization and indigenization and all of that. I mean, it's an amalgam of terminologies. I mean, when you look at philosophy, I mean, it started at the time of the Greeks and Romans and into Europe. I mean, French, German, Spanish thinkers who kind of based their foundation of education on those principles that were established. And then they come over here with their notions of education and governance and universality. I mean, it's a whole ideology trying to bring people together to almost become identical to one another. And our cultures here in North America were so diverse and respectful of the differences that we had. And so I have a difficult time trying to compare European ideologies into our indigenous, because when I speak my language, and none of those things like dominance and governance and domination and whatever, there's no such thing in our language. There's no words that describe that. And yet the game has been bring everybody into the university and make them think like all of us.
Yeah,
that's my 2 cents.
Good 2 cents.
Can I add my 2 cents if it's okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. I was just
Jane.
Pardon?
4 cents for you, Jane.
Oh, Robert. Thank you. Oh my! But I'm just kind of thinking back and like history, for instance, and sometimes I don't think we teach our young people enough about the history or even non-Indigenous people. They tend to forget why they came here. And what I heard from the elders, the reason Europeans came here, they were dying. They were dying physically, they were dying emotionally, they were pretty well dead spiritually and cognitively.
Yeah.
There was nothing left in Europe.
Yeah.
And when they came to our shores, we introduced them to different foods, we introduced them to philosophy, we introduced them to governance systems that they didn't know existed because they were used to the top down. We introduced them to true democracy and socialism, how they can walk hand in hand, how they can work together.
Yeah.
We introduced them to sciences. We introduced them to individual freedoms. And then they also took all our gold and silver.
Yeah, we shouldn't have said anything about that.
But the thing is, there are riches that our people had and shared that ended up helping Europe because they were dying, and they and our food, our corn and our potatoes kept them, at least helped them survive. So I think we have to remember where all those things came from. And remember, we never get much credit for it, but we did give an abundance of gifts to the world. But we're never recognized for those gifts. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jane. I think we have one more question that came in from the Q&A. And then I am guessing based on Deanne's posture and her unmuted microphone that we're gonna wrap up after that, maybe. So the question is, first of all, Walaliak to everyone. And the question from Cheryl Knockwood is, how can we rebuild our communities and in brackets, address addictions and rebuild our nation?
Yeah. I think that's coming at the question from the colonizer's doorway. We need to say, what do we need to do and what do our children need to do instead of what they're doing inside Euro society? The alcoholism was their disease when they came, and then it flipped, and now we're affected by it. So how do we get our kids to go back to who they were? Well, you know, I took mine up across those mountains, 27 mountains. We're climbing these mountains. And if you're all hungover, too bad. That straightened everybody out. And then they wanted to go to the Indian Olympics. And I said, yeah, but you can't drink and I'll train you. I went there with 10 sober kids and we beat everybody. It was great. That straightened those 10 kids out. And those 10 kids have 10 friends and so on and so forth. And you get them doing things that we've always done. Their grandfathers ran races 110 miles long. That's what they did when they were young. They climbed 27 mountains every summer that they were young. That takes energy. It takes good food. It takes good, clean living. That's what it takes. So we need to restore the foods, though, that they need to eat so that they can have those kinds of magnificent bodies. We need to have magnificent bodies, and they need to be doing things that we've always done. That's my thing. Rather than coming at it with, well, we have to clear up the addiction. No, we have to get them busy.
Oh, I'm sorry. There I go again. My
That's okay. You're good.
dominance mentality. God save us. No, I'm sorry. Keep going.
No, I'm done. I was done. Sorry.
Uh,
I'm good.
my interruptionist mentality. No, I think we should get out of the boxes, even for learning. We need to go back to the land to educate our people. I think young people, if they become knowledgeable about the land and things like what's happening to the Ulican in terms of the pollution in the waters and the
Clean the waters.
disruption of their migration systems, not only fish, but animals and everything else. I mean, the growth pattern and the cycles that you talk about, Leigh and Ty. I think we need to bring the basic principles of our past together forward. Principles, I think, and values that are indigenous to us.
Yeah. You know, when the Mi'kmaq girl got her feather up and the cops that were attacking her and over fracking, half hour after that happened, I was standing in Vancouver at the courthouse, and my nephew comes. He says, "We're going to have a demonstration, Auntie," and he jumps up on the podium and he says, "We're going to march up for the people of you, blah blah blah." And he tells this, and I said, "There's only 40 people here, Reuben." And he says, "Oh, but by the time we jump out in the middle of that street, all these officers at 5 o'clock are going to come down and they're going to join us. Watch." And he was talking about fracking and talking about clean living and talking about supporting the Mi'kmaq. That's what they need to be doing. He was only 26 years old when he did that. And by the time we got down to the bottom of the street, only 10 blocks, there were 5,000 people joined us. They can do it. They can do it. That's what they should be doing. And we should encourage them.
Thank you, everybody. Does anybody want to add anything? Jane, did you want to say anything? No, she's shaking her head at me.
I think Zoom sometimes is difficult to navigate as far as being polite and then having to jump in. So I will jump in, and I wanted to just really thank Leigh and Stephen and Ty. The interesting how everything you said sort of ties together, and it was really fun for me to hear Stephen talk about his birth again. We share that great-grandmother midwife, and just the welcoming to the earth and the water, and Leigh, as always, you always give me more to think about. And as a nurse, this discussion about colonization and the way, we talk about being colonized with bacteria and viruses, and what would we do to decolonize when you Western, we'd go in with antibiotics and sterilize that. And
I know, I wrote about it in Memory Serves. Colonizing of the lungs.
I know. And so, yeah, like so restore, rebirth, like that's really powerful. And then the governance tie, like I think the way you brought that in, I know that you guys do this all the time, but the way that you actually brought in Stephen and these words was just absolutely beautiful. And I just wanted to thank you, because I don't know if I'm going to sleep tonight.
And the rafters, I love that.
I feel sort of speechless, so I'm not going to say too much, but I just, Jane's words were kind of ringing in my ears of, what does reconciliation really mean? Walking on the land with love, and walking hand in hand with love and respect for each other and the land. And I don't know if we could say it any better. I feel like I have nothing to add, and all of you have have just shared so much wisdom with us tonight and so much to think about. I think that I'm not alone probably in saying it's all a bit overwhelming in a wonderful way. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and our commentators too, for your ability to kind of bring pieces together and connect the dots. Thank you so much. And now we're going to turn to Jane, who is going to close the event for us.
Okay, before I do close, I want to do say one more thing. When I was saying why the Europeans arrived, it was spirit that called them. That's what our elders tell us. It was spirit that called them, and it was the spiritual resources that called them. But when they arrived, they saw the material resources. And, you know, hopefully now it may have taken 500 years, but maybe their descendants are now learning about those spiritual gifts and what called them here in the first place.
Right.
Thank you. Isok, iniskamijina, ugamijina, asa hawegi, muiwalolek, uchid, adel maktes kadvutiek. Walaliek dan delit koyuyek, awalaliek dan deli abohon muyek. Dan mena hawaskum kuchik igamana. Ak iskum kuchik, ewelmet, and sidwohan, ahmogi ganodi, ak salsudi. Edamulek, iganemun and want to hodi, ula sit hamo, vigina. Labiak, uchidum sit kohoy, ahachid mimajuwahan, ahachidan desid mimajuwahan, usit hamo, nadliach, sid nogama. Thank you.
Let's go. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you guys again.
Thank
All
you,
of you.
everyone.
Thank you. Walalio.
Thank you, everyone.
Potvin, Maracle.
Bye.
Bye, Stephen.
Take
Hi,
care.
everyone.
Love you all.
Bye.
Love you all.
Thank you.
Hey, Agi. Now and Goa.
Yo, Walalan.
Ganada.
Yes, and Yawa, I'm gonna look where. Gonna look where.
Take care.
Love you all.
Bye.
Love you all.
Yo, Walalan.
Ganada.
Yes, and Yawa, I'm gonna look where. Gonna look where.
Namo Tess.
Mutas.
Amo Tezekian,
Walalio.
Asiki Walaliek.
Namo Tess.
Amo Tezekian.